What's up, you sweaty nerds and greasy degenerates? Dan Heng Inhibitor Lune, aka Super Saiyan Dan, comes out in 1 week from today, and so I thought it would be good to go over his SP hungry problem, because this dude is a skill point fiend, but there's a lot of ways we can work around that. I talked about it in my build guide, but there were a lot of people in the comments of my last video talking about how skill hungry he is, whether a fast Dan is good or whether you should build a slow Dan. So I thought it would be good to go over some of that stuff in this video today. I might make a different video for team compositions, but we'll talk about that in this video a little bit as well if we have the time for it. So let's stop wasting our time and get into it. Super Saiyan Dan has a skill point problem. And what do we mean by that? Well, Super Saiyan Dan is constantly on the streets. He's constantly down on his luck because he is addicted to skill points. Super Saiyan Dan is a skill point fiend, but I can fix him. You can fix him, we can all fix him with the right relics, with the right build, with the right team compositions. But what do we mean by that? What does being a skill point hungry character mean? In Dan's case, Dan has an enhanced basic attack that he can use. 3 different versions of it, but all of them require either stacks of his special ability, or it requires SP energy that we build up during battle. But if we're constantly using skill point energy, we don't build up his ultimate. Now it should be noted that Dan Heng's ultimate, as long as he's not nerfed or crazily changed before release, his enhanced basic attack 3 actually deals far more damage than his ultimate. Dan Heng's ultimate is mostly there in order to give him stacks so that he can continue to use his enhanced basic attack. So just something to be aware of there. In fact, it might be optimal to not necessarily use his ultimate as much as you might think, but it is probably more optimal to build it up quickly, then use it, gain stacks, and then maintain stacks throughout battle. That's probably the best way to use Dan, but this worries a lot of people. People are really worried about being able to use Dan properly because he might be consuming too much skill point energy or too many stacks of his ability too quickly. This is why I made a build that I put out yesterday for how we can potentially fix that. But a lot of people in the comments are still a bit worried about how we're going to be able to deal with Dan. So let's talk about different relics we can use to fix his SP problem and different team compositions we can do in order to be able to fix his SP problem. Now I didn't label this video, I didn't title it with Dan Heng has a speed problem, because I did that with Kafka's video, but he also can be fixed by giving him speed. And a lot of people seem to think that a fast Dan is even more skill point hungry. It's not. Every turn that he starts at, it doesn't matter whether he's fast or whether he's slow. He still builds up energy the same way. And you can work around him by giving him fast team members as well, but you could also give him team members that help him with his energy problem, because Dan can build up energy himself too. He doesn't have to have his entire team going fast with him. It would just be very helpful. So let's talk about it a little bit more. So before we talk about whether you may want to build a Dan Heng for speed or not, let's talk about his energy regeneration. In the comments of my last video, we were discussing how you can actually use Dan Heng's signature light cone along with his energy regeneration rope, and you can actually potentially build his ultimate twice as fast as a Dan Heng that does not have his signature light cone or energy regeneration rope, meaning like in 2 turns versus like in 4 turns. And that's actually incredibly powerful, but it should be noted as well that if you don't have Dan Heng's signature light cone, because a lot of you aren't going to have his signature light cone, he can still build his ultimate up to a turn faster than a Dan Heng that does not have energy regeneration rope. So that energy regeneration rope is very powerful and very useful, very valuable. And it should be noted that these calculations don't include whether Dan Heng is built for speed or not, because if you have your Dan Heng built for speed, he can gain energy even quicker in a rotation. So when you think about a rotation, he could have 2 turns in a rotation versus only 1 if your Dan Heng is slow. And if a Dan Heng is faster, he's also going to be clearing mobs faster, and you gain energy back when you defeat enemies. And besides that, the math, by the way, does not factor in whether he's getting hit by enemies or whether he's taking out enemies or not. That should be noted. But it does obviously mean that if your Dan Heng is built for speed, this energy regeneration occurs even quicker than that. So I just wanted to talk about that real quick because I think that people that believe that a slow Dan is better because they think that your teammates have to be used in order to build up his SP, it's not necessarily true. Dan Heng can build up his SP on his own as well, and that's really, really valuable. And a lot of people pointed out that Dan Heng is a hypercarry DPS, so he's going to be skill hungry, just like a Sela or a Jingyuan. He's going to be rather skill hungry as a hypercarry DPS, and it's no different than whether you have like a Sela on your team who can potentially use her skill like 3 times in a turn. You know what I mean? That's crazy. She has Resurgence that gives her an extra turn. Plenty of people end up having to use a basic attack with a Sela every once in a while, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. You're getting an extra turn. It's not changing your rotation, you just get more damage for free, dude. It's not a bad thing. So, just something to think about there. So we are going to go over some team compositions for Super Saiyan Dan, whether you are building him for speed or not. And we are going to, of course, factor in his SP problem because he is addicted when we talk about those team compositions. But let's talk about whether you want to build a speed Dan or not. Basically, a fast Dan or not. And by the way, it should be noted, I'm not saying that slow Dan is bad. I'm just saying that fast Dan is good. I'm not telling you not to build slow Dan. I'm just informing y'all that fast Dan is good, and fast Dan helps deal with his skill point problem, because he is addicted. So let's go into a fast Dan, and I talked about this in the last video in the comment section. I used this as an example. Let's just say that you're building a slow Dan that has attack percent boots and has attack percent rope. And he deals like 1,000,000 damage in one rotation. Okay, I'm just going to throw out numbers here because it's pre-release information. I'm not supposed to talk about it, okay? So I'm talking about what I feel comfortable talking about here, okay? So these numbers are just made up, all right? But let's compare that, like 1,000,000 damage in one rotation, to a fast Dan that's using speed boots and energy regeneration rope. Now, by the way, you don't have to use speed boots if you got good enough substats. If you got lucky enough with your substat rolls and you have 134 speed, by all means, dude, you don't need the other speed necessarily. Just use the attack percent boots. The speed boots are just a fix in case you didn't get good enough substat rolls, okay? Some people don't get lucky. That's the way the game works, unfortunately. But let's just throw out some numbers here, okay? Let's say the fast Dan gets 850,000 damage on that rotation because the damage reduction, because he doesn't have attack percent relics on those 2 slots. But he gets to go again in the same rotation. He gets to go twice because he's been built for speed. He's fast enough. So let's say he does 850,000 damage on the first attack. The second attack he does like maybe 250,000 damage. That's like 1.1 million damage. Of course, these numbers are made up, so it could be higher, it could be slightly lower, but these are just some numbers being thrown out. But Dan Heng will also build his energy back faster because the first attack burned his stacks, the second attack won't use any stacks. He can just use a basic attack or something like that in order to gain some energy back. Something to think about there. Fast Dan builds back energy quicker. And just like with Sela, don't sit here and act to me like you only use your skill with Sela. There's plenty of people that Sela's going way too fast, she's doing too much stuff, she's using her skill points like crazy, and occasionally you have to throw out a basic attack. This is the exact same type of style that's going to happen with Dan. Occasionally Dan's going to throw out a basic attack, and it's not a bad thing. He gets extra turns if he's going fast enough. It's not a loss of damage, it is increased damage. Something to think about there. The overall damage in the battle is what matters more than one single attack. We know this because of Jingyuan, right? Jingyuan's not bad, But he has one super high-powered attack that goes off every once in a while, but the rest of the time he's not dealing as much damage. It's what matters overall in the battle. That's why Kafka has overtaken him on tier lists, because the overall damage that she deals in a battle is more than a Jing Yuan would do, because it's about the whole battle as a whole, not just one single attack, not just one big flashy number. It's about all of the accumulative numbers throughout the battle, okay? So just think about that. A faster Dan will also more than likely clear all the mobs. So a fast Dan gets to have more turns. He's going to empty out the mobs quicker than a slow Dan will. What does clearing out mobs do? It empties out the field, the whole team is taking less damage, and he's gaining energy. Defeating enemies gains energy. So he's also going to gain energy faster if he gets more attacks off. It's not going to kill the boss right away, but it's going to clear all of the mobs and gain him a bunch of energy, building his ultimate quicker. So that's obviously something that's really good and valuable as well, that I think people aren't factoring in when they talk about a slow Dan versus a fast Dan. Because Dan Heng has a multi-hit that hits more than one enemy most of the time. He's going to be hitting like 3 enemies at once a lot of the time, breaking shields, you know, clearing out the trash mobs. It's going to be awesome. I really, really like the design behind a fast Dan. I believe in it very strongly. And I believe a lot of y'all will too. Consider the fact that a fast Dan is going to clear Memory of Chaos faster than a slow Dan will probably be doing. Of course, the battle is randomized, it's a bit different. Some people will end up clearing roughly the same cycle times depending on what happens with the enemies, but a fast Dan will consistently be able to clear Memory of Chaos and things like that quicker than a slow Dan will. So definitely something to consider there, and that has a lot of value. I do want to point out before we talk about the teams that if you are building a fast Dan, that ideally you do want to have a fast team as well. So you do want your whole team to try to reach that 134 speed threshold. It is not absolutely necessary, but it is the ideal scenario. So please understand that you should build a fast team as well to be the most optimal. But here we are in the game, and I do want to make, I think, a dedicated video just to team compositions for Dan, because it seems potentially necessary at this point. But I want to mention some support characters that can help Dan with his SP issues, and some other units if you don't have SP issues as well, because Dan Heng is helplessly addicted to skill points, and there are a lot of units that can help him with that, like Ting Yun. Ting Yun can be a really, really solid support for a Dan Heng team, because she literally gives the character that she's buffing energy. It's like, what do we have? Skill point problems. What does she do? Fix that. Literally, like glue, she's going to come through and fix your skill point problems if you have them. She also gives a really solid damage multiplier. And if you have her at E1, by the way, E0, Ting Yun's a very solid unit to support with Dan, but at E1, she also gives speed for 1 turn when she uses her ultimate. And at E4, she gives an overall damage multiplier to the character with Benediction. Dan Heng is going to be your character that has Benediction. This overall damage multiplier is very, very solid. It is a damage multiplier. Just remember that it is a very solid multiplier. So just remember that that exists. But you also have Bronya. Bronya will be giving Dan Heng extra turns. The more turns Dan Heng has, the faster he will be cycling through his abilities, the faster he will be gaining energy back as well. So definitely consider Bronya if you have Bronya. And of course, don't forget about Asta. She's probably the worst support that I'm going to be mentioning today, but she's not necessarily bad. She provides a speed buff as well as an attack buff. So Asta is very solid. If you don't have any of these other characters leveled and you don't have the ability to level them yet, Asta is a very, very solid fill-in for a support slot for Dan Heng. However, if you have built Dan for speed and with energy regeneration rope, you probably don't have a skill point problem anymore. So you can use Silverwolf, an incredibly solid support for any character really, but incredibly great support for a Dan Heng, because she can apply weakness to the enemy that's really going to help Dan, and she also debuffs, which will also really, really help Dan. And in turn, Pela, her ultimate debuffs all of the enemies, and Dan Heng has a 3 enemy hit Most of his attacks hit 3 enemies at once. This is very valuable. Silverwolf can only debuff 1 enemy at a time. So Pela, very, very solid free-to-play option. And Yukong, very solid option as well. If you have her at E6, she's fucking incredible. But don't forget that she's also valuable when she's not at E6. The only problem with Yukong is that her speed is something that's kind of harder to work around, but she also provides crit values as well. Dan Heng loves to crit, so Yukong is a very solid unit. She also gives a damage buff for units that are using imaginary. So she boosts the imaginary damage of imaginary units. Guess what Dan is? An imaginary unit. So these are very, very solid support options for Dan as well. Don't forget about Welt. If you are building mono imaginary, Welt is an amazing character for a mono imaginary team as well. If this video was entertaining to you in any way, shape, or form, please leave a like and subscribe, because if you don't subscribe, I'm gonna come to your house in the middle of the night like the boogeyman, and I'm gonna steal your favorite midnight snacks. Probably those Oreos, or maybe those Pringles you got in the pantry. Maybe the lasagna you got there in the refrigerator. I'm not picky. I'll come for whatever you got. So like and subscribe for more.